Well, good morning, everyone, and happy Independence Day. Happy 4th of July. It's 10 o'clock Eastern Time. I don't know what time it is in Italy right now, but that's where we are. We're the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire. My name is Jeff Rapsis. I'm the director of the Aviation Museum. Good morning, everyone, and just let me adjust my sound for a minute here. It's 10 o'clock. There, okay, so we are in Italy, and we're going to be doing a live stream of a virtual flight from Naples, Italy, town in the southern part of the country, up to Rome. And we're going to be exploring the connections between this part of the world and the world of the founders, the people that wrote the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and got this country going, which is what we're celebrating today on the 4th of July. And before we go any further, a couple introductions. With me, I'm not making the flight alone today. With me are Mr. Robert Huff, Bob Huff, who is on our board of directors, and Bob is a pilot and an expert in all things aviation. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us on this wonderful day and celebration of the 4th of July.
Also with us is a gentleman, Chuck Gerhan, who has served our country in the Navy as a naval aviator for quite a long career. I don't know the exact number of years, 30?
It was 28.
28, almost, okay. Chuck, good morning. How are you?
I'm feeling pretty good this morning.
That's good.
Maybe deaf by tonight after we hear enough fireworks, but looks like a good day to celebrate.
Yes, and it is, it's a day for celebration, and it's a little different this year because of coronavirus and COVID-19. That's one of the reasons we're doing this. Our museum, which is based at the Manchester-Boston Regional Airport in Manchester, New Hampshire, we have an educational outreach program in which we try to inspire young people about aviation and aerospace. Even though the latest news reports show that industry kind of in turmoil, at least the commercial aviation industry, it's still a great career path for young people, and we try to encourage people to think about what they're learning in their science classes, especially as the very basic foundation for a great career in aviation, aerospace. But that whole program really got put on hold about 4 months ago because of coronavirus. Not only did our museum have to close down to the public, but the whole education outreach thing had to stop. And we thought, what can we do to continue this outreach in a world of remote learning? And what we did was we took our flight simulator, which we have here at the museum, and we took enhanced terrain software, thanks to an IT consultant who's a big helper of us named Jay Carter, who's here at the controls today. And Jay, I'll introduce you now. How are you doing this morning?
Very well, Jeff. Glad to be here.
Jay has engineered all of the things that are needed for us to be able to make this flight today virtually. And we created a program where we're flying around the world. We started in Manchester on May 1st, and we've hopscotched our way across the Atlantic down into Europe, which is where we are now. And every few days we make a flight, and we talk about the things we're flying over. We talk about the culture, the history, the geography. And while we're mentioning this, I think I want to mention a couple other folks who've helped us with this. Aura Lassler has been the webmaster for this. So if you're looking at our live stream through our website, it's nhahs.org, and you can find us on a link on that site. Aura has been responsible for putting all the things together online, so thank you, Aura. And also Lee Howenstein and Wendell Berthelsen have been great members of our tech committee helping us get this project together as we've been working our way around the world. It's all come together so that we found we were able to make live stream flights on certain key moments. So last Memorial Day, we happened to be near Normandy, France. So we did a 2-hour flight over the beaches in Normandy to talk about the sacrifices that were made that day on Memorial Day. It was a great way to celebrate it. Now here we are, 4th of July. We're in Italy. What the heck can we do with Italy and the 4th of July? And my liberal arts education caused me to remember, well, wait a minute, the founders, the people that did all the work to create this country and why we celebrate the 4th of July, their inspiration was a lot of what went on in this part of the world 2,000 years ago, mostly at the time when the Roman Republic was in the throes of transition and later became the Roman Empire. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes downstream here, but they had a classical education, as many people did back in those days, And they knew the ideas and the literature that were part of the Roman heritage, and it inspired them in many ways, which I said we'll explore later on. But we're on the runway at Naples now. I wanted to at least let our sponsors know that we really appreciate their support of this program. So let's take a minute before we take off. You'll see we have a wide range of supporters for this program that has taken us from Manchester, New Hampshire, all the way to Naples today. We'll be continuing after this all the way around the world, landing in Manchester. Targeted date is Saturday, August 15th. So put that on your calendars. Getting us there have been Wirebelt, a great company right here in Londonderry, New Hampshire, just up the hill from us. The New Hampshire Humanities people have given us a major grant to support our program, and we thank them for that. Our friends at Manchester Boston Regional Airport have been big supporters, and we really appreciate their support, and not just because they're our landlord, but because they've been just terrific to work with, and they're part of the airport community here. A company called Terra Fugia, which is a company that is doing an interesting project. They are creating a flying car. I know that sounds like something out of the Jetsons, but they really are creating a vehicle that is both drivable on highways and can be converted quickly to an aircraft that can be flown in and out of an airport. And we'll be working with them on other projects down the line, so thanks for their support. Signature Flight Support, the operator here at the Manchester-Boston Regional Airport, has been a big supporter. We have the Queen City Rotary has given us a grant to get us off the ground. And then also in-kind support from J.D. Carter Information Technology. That's Jay's company. And then So Many Aircraft publishes a lot of material online. That's Aura Lassiter's operation. And I encourage you to check both of those websites out and support the folks who've been supporting us. And I want to thank our board of directors at the Aviation Museum who've given us the sort of the green light to experiment and try this program out. We didn't know how it would work, but it's turned out to be a very popular program that we're hoping to develop in different ways for next fall and maybe even beyond. Coronavirus or not, it looks like we've created a way for kids to learn a lot using a flight simulator in ways that I don't know if anyone else is doing it. So very excited to do this, and thanks to the board of directors for giving us enough room to make this flight. So I think it's time to take off, don't you, Jay?
Let's go.
Okay, let's go. We're going to do, we're going to hear some radio chatter, I think, and we're going to be taking off a little bit about our aircraft. It's not just any aircraft. This is a vintage aircraft. It's a C-47. You saw pictures of it probably earlier as we were getting ready to go. And it's a military version of an aircraft called the DC-3. Bob Huff, a little about our aircraft today. If you were introducing this to someone who'd never seen it or flown it, what would you tell them?
Well, it was probably the most versatile and widely used plane in the world. It was developed in the mid to late 30s, and it was the first real modern-looking airplane, I guess, with cantilever wing and good accommodations inside. It really brought air travel to the masses.
And it's a twin-engine plane.
Yes, it's a twin-engine Pratt Whitney radial, 1200 horsepower each engine, and very widely used for both passenger and cargo use. And they're still widely used today, and they've even put turbines on the aircraft to modernize them. So it's a classic that has just stood the test of time and just been, it's a great aircraft.
And what we're doing is we're taking off from Naples, Italy, and what we're seeing below are parts of that city. We're going to be heading first to Mount Vesuvius, which is to the south of Naples. You'll see it come into view pretty soon, I believe, as we make the flight out of Naples. And the reason we're doing that is because Vesuvius was the volcano that erupted in the year 8079 and buried Pompeii, a Roman town at the time, and there's a lot to talk about with that. So we're going to get to Pompeii. We're going to fly over what we can see there. You can see Vesuvius kind of looming in the center there. And then we will fly north up the coast of Italy over an area called Latium, and then out to the coast again that we'll get to Anzio, which is an important World War II battle site. And then we'll fly inland to Rome, and we'll see all that you see when you visit Rome today. There's a lot of things left over from the Roman days that will show up as we fly over the city, including, well, we'll see the Vatican as well and some other great monuments. And then we'll be landing at Leonardo da Vinci Airport, which is Rome's main airport. It's back out towards the coast. Talk about an original aviation pioneer. Leonardo was 500 years ago. He was coming up with ways for humans to do what the birds could do so easily. Right, Bob?
Yeah, he was really a visionary and just a remarkable person with the drawings he made and his focus on flight. And, there's a famous quote of his that says, "For once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward. For there you have been, and there you will always long to return." So
Wow.
even way back then, he understood how wonderful it is to be able to fly and how magical it is. And we're all passionate about flying and aviation. And during this trip we've had from leaving New Hampshire, traveling all the way to Italy, I think all of you who have followed along can understand the joy and the passion of being in the air and seeing the wonders that nature have to offer. And Da Vinci understood that way back then, and he had never been in the air, but he really was a visionary.
He studied birds, actually. He sketched birds, and that sort of powered his dream for flight. And we'll talk more about him, I think, as we get closer to the airport named after him. It's a great way to finish up here. One thing I've been really intrigued about, if people are interested, if you go back into our flight segments, we've done 17 of these since we left Manchester. Almost every segment we find some aviation pioneer connected with some area that I never knew about. So the world is full of these great stories of people that dreamed of flight in the early days and made efforts to try to mimic the birds. It's something that there's great stories that should be told more often, I think, because they go to what you were saying, Bob. They are this dream that people have had all over the world, no matter what your cultural background is, no matter what your perspective is, the human dream of flight. I mean, we were dreaming about flight before we could fly, literally. And so it's just it's hardwired into us, I think. So.
It really is, and it's just even after all these years of flying, and we get on airplanes and have to go through TSA and wait at the airport, and to a lot of people it's nothing but a burden.
Yeah.
But I'm telling you, it's just so magical to be able to just fly the way we do and to see the world
Yes.
and it's shortened the world tremendously. It's probably made the biggest difference in the social interaction of the world, being able to fly, than any other technology that's ever come along.
Well, we're flying over Mount Vesuvius. You can see it's an active volcano. It's not a large volcano. I was just looking up the numbers. Mount Garfield in New Hampshire is actually taller than Mount Vesuvius. It's only about 4,000 feet high. It erupts regularly. It last erupted, I believe, during World War II in 1944. But the big one it had, it occasionally blows its top in a big way. Oh, there we are, flying over the volcano, is from AD 79. When it was a quiet afternoon. The old-time date was August 24th, but actually new research has called into question whether that's the actual date that this happened. It shows you how sparse the records are from even the height of the Roman Empire, which was then, that we're not really sure of the date of the eruption. There were only a few eyewitness accounts, and archaeologists have found fruit and other vegetables that were only produced later than August in the ruins of Pompeii, and so it's called into question that date. But whatever the date was, it was just a pleasant afternoon when this volcano came to life in a huge way. It erupted with a column of ash that was dozens of miles high and wound up raining ash on the area that Pompeii was in and a few other Roman towns south of what is now Naples. And then also released these flows of superheated mud that came down the side of the volcano and raced into the valleys and unfortunately went right into where Pompeii is. And it entombed the city all at once. It froze it in time almost, although frozen is not the right way to put it because it was superheated mud and gases that came roaring through. And it just leveled the town. It didn't really level the town, it covered it up in a way that buried it. And so Pompeii was lost for all purposes. There were other eruptions later that covered it up, but that was it for Pompeii. Until about the 1600s, excavations began because there was some sign that there was something underground there, and it turned out that the lost city of Pompeii had been rediscovered. And this was a time when it helped create more interest in the Roman Empire in the 1600s and 1700s, because suddenly we had this whole city that could be dug into and we could find out what life was like in Rome. That helped fuel the interest in Rome at the time of the founders in the 1700s in the United States, because Pompeii was only being discovered then. Today, Pompeii is an active archaeological site. You can go down there from Rome on a train. You just take the train right to the Pompeii station, and you walk up and go through a gate, and you can see on the right-hand side of our screen there's sort of an area that's brown, and that's the larger part of the excavation. We're going to fly out and come back over it, I believe, to get a better view. But it's a large area. I mean, it was a city at the time, and it's been in stages being uncovered. It's still being worked, and there's just no end to that process. What we gain from that is something that we can't get from the literature that's come down from Rome. We have texts that the founders studied, the great texts of Cicero and the poets and all the other Romans. But what we get from Pompeii is a sense of everyday life as it was lived in the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. And it was an empire then. It had really transitioned from a republic to the empire at that point. And this was a typical Roman city that had been settled after Naples. It was for the upper class, and it was preserved by Mother Nature for us to be able to study today in a way that gives us a great sense of what day-to-day life was for people in a typical Roman community. So, Jay, we are sort of circling back around now. We're south of Naples, or where are we?
Yeah, just crossing back over the coast, and you'll see off to our right. You're going to see some little bit of the ruins will start to show up there.
Now, because they're ruins close to the ground, we're not going to be able to get right close to them. But on our website, you'll see pictures that show it in more detail. Let's get a little close up here of some of the areas that are excavated. You can see the rail line that goes right through there that you take your train to visit. And this area that's on the left-hand side of the screen now is the sort of whole Pompeii area that has been uncovered and is still being excavated by archaeologists. They didn't have a train system in the Roman times, but it makes it more convenient for us to get there to see the site. It's largely open to the public, but there are some areas that have to be closed off because they're actively being worked. And there's you'll see the forum. There's a theater that they've uncovered right there. Look at that. All of this was buried by about 20 feet of ash, I think, and mud. And only little bits of it were sticking up above the ground after it was over. And the buildings that were sticking up, the people like looters would come afterwards and get down into them, and they actually would mark the insides of the buildings to tell other looters that they had already been there. And so archaeologists have found buildings with old Latin graffiti from the looters to each other. But that all stopped, and the thing was just totally abandoned for 1,500 years, really. What happened was when the mud came, it came so fast, people were trapped in it and died right there. And their remains did not survive, and so they decayed, but the space that was left by their remains stayed. And so archaeologists have been able to create castings of the people who had been caught in the mud to recreate what they looked like.
And even what they were doing.
What they were doing, yeah. And so it's really something, and it did help inspire sort of an interest in ancient Rome at the time of the founders, because it was in the news. It was something new that was happening then.
Do we know how many survivors there were, the people that really lived through it?
The question is how many people died, actually, is the one I often see. And
I think they all died.
They all died. I think you're right. The number of those, it's not really known, but they know they have something like 1,200 people they found. So they know that, but the town had something like 20,000 residents, and nobody survived. So.
And there was any written record at all?
No, there were just a couple of eyewitness reports from people who saw it from far away that have survived. And you can look that up. I was reading through them. It's all quite vague, and therefore we don't even know the date that it happened. Because that's subject to some debate now. I think the important thing to realize is that that Rome, one of the great civilizations of any time, here we are 2,000 years later, we have so little left over from it. We think we have lots of great stuff, but there's only a tiny fraction of the written materials that have come down to us. There's some great stuff in that, but it's only just little pieces, and we have to put the puzzle back together today as best we can. And Pompeii is like 3 corner pieces to the puzzle, to be able to create a really good picture of what was going on back in ancient Rome that helped inspire the founders. So we're going to go up over Naples on our way up the coast. About Naples, it's worth pointing out that Naples, we think of it as ultimately an Italian city now. It's the sort of metropolis of southern Italy. It's where pizza was invented, right? But it was originally a Greek city. It was part of the Greek, what would amounted to the Greek Empire before the Romans. The Magna Graecia included some far-flung settlements that were nowhere near Athens, and Naples was one of them. I forget what it was called by them, but it was definitely a Greek settlement and part of the Greek sphere of influence. And therefore, it reflected a lot of the ideals that the Romans would draw from in creating their own systems of government. And what's interesting is that when the Romans did start expanding, they eventually did take over this whole area. I think fortunately for the people of Naples at the time, they sided with the Romans rather than the Carthaginians across the ocean, across the Mediterranean Sea there. Otherwise, Rome would have wiped them out too, like they did the Carthaginians. But Rome actually looked at Naples as a sort of like a model Greek community, and they admired it, and they preserved it, and that people still spoke Greek there well into the Roman times. So it's kind of unusual. It's not a Roman community at all. Historically, it's more of a Greek community. So the Romans were drawing their inspiration from all the achievements of the Greeks, which that sort of peaked a little bit before the Roman Empire or the Roman Republican Empire got going. And Naples was one of those places that inspired the Romans as they began expanding in all directions from their original headquarters in Rome.
Now tell me this isn't magical to be able to tour such historic sites and see them from the air and travel along and just see the wonders that are there. It's very magical to be in an airplane doing this.
Now, Chuck, you were stationed not here, but sort of behind us in Sicily for a time. So this was an area that you were in nearby anyway.
Yes, I was up in this area a little bit. We were stationed with a maritime patrol squadron in Sigonella, Sicily, and made some trips into Italy, although mostly our flights were over the Mediterranean following shipping. And the discussion of shipping in the Mediterranean is a whole different subject, but a very busy one.
Mm-hmm. Well, there you see our DC-3 from frontal view. We have an application. This is all rendered, by the way, by terrain software, and some of it's drawn from Google Earth, I think, is one of the sources that are used to create this picture we're seeing. The aircraft is a separate piece of software. It's got all of our logos on it because we're supporting our sponsors that way. The engine noises that you're hearing are realistic, and they really are. I recall as a kid a DC-3 flying into Nashua, where I grew up, to the airport, and they have a distinctive sound when they're coming in for a landing, and this mimics that perfectly. There's the flight deck, and we have it's for 2 people, but today Jay is in the left-hand seat. And who's in the right-hand seat, Bob? Is that our John, our mysterious co-pilot?
Our mysterious co-pilot, who when there's a mistake or something happens, we blame him.
As well we should, yes. And it's funny, the different parts of the aircraft are operable in ways that I didn't expect. This is all simulated, of course, but we can open the windows. There we go. We can open the windows. We can open the doors if we want to jump out, which we don't do because we have no parachutes today. Unless, Bob, you pack some parachutes and didn't tell us.
Just one.
Just one? That's great. Well, we're going over Naples, which is a beautiful city to visit, just in its own right. It's one of these great European cities. I didn't know this, Naples was the second largest city in Europe in the year 1600. It was a hugely successful shipping center and mercantile town. Only Paris was bigger. in the year 1600. And yet what happened to Naples was in 1656, the bubonic plague hit the town and killed actually half the people in Naples, and that brought their days of glory to an end really quickly. So how's that for a contemporary reference while we're all dealing with the coronavirus? Something to think about.
While we're looking in the cockpit, you can see that there's 6 levers, 3 sets of 2. From the left to right, that's the propeller control on the left, the throttle's in the middle, and the mixture on the right. So each group is one for the left engine, one for the right. And the propeller is like changing gears in a car. The throttle is just like the accelerator on a car. You can see the T on that.
Mm-hmm.
And the mixture is to change the mixture of the gas, the fuel and air ratio, because as you get up higher, the air gets thinner, and you have to reduce the amount of fuel that's mixed with it, so you have a good combustion mixture of the fuel and air going into it. So you have one for each engine: left prop, left throttle, right throttle, and left mixture and right mixture.
And there's nothing digital about this aircraft, is there? This is from the analog days, where everything was mechanical or electromechanical, and it still works fine. You have to have modern communications in it, of course, but it's from another era, but it still flies.
Still flies, still works fine.
As long as we have enough fuel.
And the prop control, I say that's like changing gears in a car. What that does is it changes the pitch of the propeller. So it either takes a big bite out of the air or a smaller bite out of the air. And that changes the load on the engine, just like if you change gears in a car, it changes the load on the engine. You wouldn't start a car up in 4th gear, it just won't work. It lugs the engine too much. So the same with an airplane. When you change the pitch of the prop, you have a different pitch on takeoff versus cruise, just like in a car when you're starting up on a road versus traveling on the highway. So it serves the same purpose.
Well, we're heading north out of Naples now, and I think our next landmark is going to be the town of Latina. Jay, is that correct coming up?
Yeah.
We have a few minutes?
I think we have a bit of a distance on that.
Good, okay, because I want to do some background. First, I want to welcome everybody who's here. We have a good crowd according to the numbers here watching us, which is great. Feel free to comment on the side. You should have a panel to your right that'll allow you to join the conversation. We've received word from Cheryl Fair, who hopes to get to this area in person one day. I think that's a great thing to remember. We're doing it virtually. There is no substitute for being there yourself, so when we can all travel again, this part of the world is well worth visiting. And Lee Howenstein from our committee, he mentions that he's been to this area and that Herculaneum, which is a neighboring town of Pompeii, was also buried, and it's worth visiting as well. I think there were 4 Roman communities that were lost to Vesuvius when it erupted, and Pompeii is only the most notable. Cheryl also writes she'd like to see some of the World War II sites around Naples. Well, we'll be talking World War II in a few minutes. Anzio is going to be the focal point of that, but let's remember there are people with us even today who fought the incredible fight, the multi-year battle up the Italian peninsula to retake that area during World War II. It was tough enough to get into North Africa with Rommel and all of the German troops there, but once we were able to get to Italy, it was no cakewalk. It was I think it's an unsung story, really. It doesn't get, we talk about the war in Europe and the Pacific theater, but Italy itself was this incredible battle that went on for years and years, little by little, to regain that peninsula. And we'll talk about that a little bit with Anzio. I think for the time we have before Latina, where we're going to talk about the Romans' language, the Latin, I'd like to just give us a little perspective here about what we're doing. This is about the connections between our the founders of our nation on this 4th of July and this part of the world many, many years before that. Before we were talking, before we had our broadcast today, Chuck and I were talking about one word. The word is virtue. And Chuck, the word virtue, where did that come into this when we were talking about this earlier?
When we were considering Rome in the ancient days, they were going through some government transitions. They became a republic after they had dictatorship leading, and then that moved from the republic to the empire. at just about the time it became of interest to our founders here. So they were looking at a country they were really founding for a model somewhere in their experience, and they were classically educated, as we said earlier, which might fit in what they were trying to develop here in North America.
Well, and it's interesting. I think, to my knowledge, none of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence or wrote the Constitution ever visited Italy. Adams and some of the others, they were ambassadors to France and the Netherlands.
No, it was their education that allowed them to understand that.
But yeah,
But they developed the word. They didn't develop the word, but they inherited the word virtue as being key to what they were trying to do.
yes,
Citizenship in this country of America that they were beginning to found was based on a characteristic of citizens called virtue. If virtue wasn't there, there would be no country eventually. People like Ben Franklin felt that very strongly. It was intrinsic in their philosophy of politics that virtue had to be behind the action of the citizenry in government.
yes, and all of this is language. As I said, they never visited this part of the world. They never saw the ruins, but they had the texts that have come down to us from what we now call ancient Rome to look at as sort of guideposts for a civilization that had gone through great transitions in the past. And how did that work? How did the transition from one form of government to another play out? And what were the important issues? And to a large extent, they found inspiration in some of the writings of authors such as Cicero and the speeches of orators such as Cicero in this whole play of liberty versus tyranny. And what motivates a person to want to do more for his or her country? What motivates a person to do more than for just him or herself? What is the individual's role to a larger society? And in creating a new country and breaking away from Britain, not only did we want to establish something that that found inspiration in the ideals of ancient Rome, but used their lessons to build the best form of government we could, that also include a lot of the Greek philosophy, too, that the Romans had picked up through the Greek concept of democracy. The Romans at the time, just a little primer, as Chuck mentioned, for the first couple of hundred years, Rome, as we know it, was run by some kings. I know oversimplifying this tremendously, but just to be brief, in the year 500 BC or so, they were overthrown by the citizenry, essentially, and a new experiment started, the Republic, where a group of people, senators, all men, and sort of the leaders of the community, would pick two people, consuls, who would run the military and the government, and this would change periodically, and it was quite possibly the most elaborate form of early democracy that was ever practiced at that time. And in different flavors and forms, this went on for almost 500 years, this republic. There were various definitions of citizens and other things changed throughout it, but the idea of a representative semi-democracy or a republic prevailed. But towards the end, there were a lot of stresses happening. There was a lot of civil war happening, and eventually Rome wound up becoming an empire under the control of a strong leader, the emperor. In that transition, and that happened about the time of Julius Caesar, just before what we now call the birth of Christ, about 30 BC or so. That transition, 100 years before or after, is when a lot of the great orators and speeches were made that gave the founders inspiration. This whole debate of how much, what is the balance between liberty and tyranny that's good for society? And all of the founders, before they ever thought they'd be starting a new country, learned of these things when they were being educated at then Harvard College or the College of William and Mary. They were the elite of their time, and a college education was largely learning Latin and Greek. And it was not so much a science-based education as it was about the classical scholarship that was the basis of an educated person. So that's a little primer on what we're talking about today. The Roman Empire spanned, in one form or another, spanned 2,000 plus
See,
years.
I just find that remarkable and amazing. You look at our country, we're what, 244 years?
This is our 244th birthday, if yes.
Birthday, and just one piece of the Roman Empire was 500 years.
Yeah.
And the whole, empire was 2,000 years. And there's two things I think I've learned on all our travels from New Hampshire, traveling around the world. One is, I wish I had paid attention in school. This history is just so fascinating and so incredible, and the architecture and the paintings and the arts and it's just remarkable. And the other is, I need to go there. I need to see it in person. And so, Cheryl, you're right. We need to go and look. We need to learn. We need to appreciate. And it's just remarkable.
Well, it is. Chuck, you've had a chance to really travel the world with the Navy, and do you find that to be the case?
Well, I think it's definitely true. It's very broadening. I was trying to remember, carved in stone throughout Rome and throughout ancient Roman influenced areas are the letters, I think it's SPQR,
Mm-hmm.
is that right? Which stands for the principles that we've just been talking about. The Senate and the people make the Republic of Rome.
Yes. And what we know about Rome, the things that are still here are carved in stone. So much was not. And we can only guess at so much about the Roman Empire. But some of the writings that have come down to us in Latin are the ones that the founding fathers would have studied in the time they were being educated. And we're talking about people in this colonial era in the 1740s, 1730s. Harvard College was still just a brand new place, really, at that time, in this untamed wilderness, essentially. That here we are learning about ancient Rome. It shows you how prevalent the classics were to be an educated person at that time. And nowadays, it's only a really small part of education. But you could argue that the fundamentals that the Romans dealt with, some of the questions and problems that they wrestled with, are just as relevant today. And it's unfortunate that we don't receive a better grounding in them. I think there's so much else to learn now in terms of science and technology that it's only natural for it to not be the focus anymore. But it might be worth reacquainting ourselves with what people in the past have done, even though their technology did not allow them to do what we do, which is not only fly over the landscape, but do it in a virtual sense,
Right.
Without even having to be there. And look at the weather today, by the way. What a great weather we've conjured up for ourselves today. A sky that has just enough clouds to look friendly. I love it. As we continue up the Italian coast.
I remember taking Latin in high school, and my instructor was Mr. O'Neill.
Mm.
And it was an all-boys school, and I remember, the only thing I remember from my Latin is when he'd walk in the room and go, parva examinatio puere. That means, little test today, boys. That's how we'd come in when he'd given us a quiz.
Wow. Well, you remembered it.
Parva examinatio puere. Now, somebody's going to correct me, because I know I didn't say that right. But
How could you forget, though?
yeah, little test today, boys.
So off to the off the coast is this, I may get this wrong, is this the Tyrrhenian Sea that it's part of the Mediterranean Sea?
Tyrrhenian, yes.
Is it? That's what it is. Okay. And it's the west coast of Italy. Further up, you would follow Italy, you get to France, and that would be where all the great resorts like Nice and Cannes are, and Monte Carlo. But we're not going to go up that far today. We're going to go only a little bit further. Jay, where are we right now as we kind of climb up the coast?
I think we're roughly 15 minutes out of Latina.
Okay,
I'm
let's
gonna check
talk about
here.
that. All right. And Italy it looks like a boot, right? And we are still very much down on the bottom of the boot here. We're only going to go about halfway up the boot as we travel up the coast. The reason that we wanted to fly over the town of Latina is that it's part of this region that in ancient times was called Latium. And I think it's really interesting that the Romans, when they began becoming a force to be reckoned with, they drew their linguistic inspiration from this little part, which wasn't even part of Rome, but it was just a sort of a rural area. And at that time, you could just go over a hill and people would be talking a different dialect. There was no international language of any kind. But the Romans wound up adopting what they used in this area called Latium. And I don't know as much about it as I'd like to, but it was the alphabet they used was a combination of the old Phoenician characters and some Greek letters. And the Romans adopted it as their language. And then when Rome began expanding, first up and down the Italian peninsula, and then all around the Mediterranean basin, and then as far as Northern Europe and Egypt and the Mideast, and even as far as Britain, everywhere they went, they carried Latin with them. It was the language of the empire. So even though there were local dialects everywhere, Latin became the international language of its day. And the foundation was strong enough for many languages to evolve from it. We call them the Romance languages. The direct descendants of Latin are French and Spanish and Italian and Portuguese and Romanian, which is a Romance language. There are some dialects in Switzerland that are still spoken, like Romanche. You can hear Roman right in that. It's an old Latin dialect. And then other languages like English borrowed so much from these Romance languages that Latin is a real strong thread in English. And almost wherever you go in the globe, there are people that speak a language either primarily or secondarily that's some descendant of this little province's language that the Romans plucked out of obscurity and said, we'll use this. And once ancient Rome hit its stride, the language of the town of the people was called Vulgar Latin, just a kind of a slang dialect, I guess. But classical Latin was what was used to write in, and that's the texts that have come down to us from all the different authors that we've inherited some texts from. And it was enough for us to keep the language going after it died out when the Roman Empire sort of faded away. A big reason that Latin continued to be a strong presence was, of course, the Catholic Church. And Rome became Christian very late in the Roman Empire, but it was just enough for that to take the Latin as its language, and then Latin became the Church's language up until even our lifetimes. Wasn't it the Vatican II in 1965 where the Latin Mass was finally deprecated and wasn't required? But up until not that long ago, you go to Mass, it was an experience in Latin, descended from the people we're talking about today.
And my own experience from school days when I took Latin was the teachers would tell you how helpful it would be in your English language work, and it really was. Grammar, spelling, word origins, all kinds of things like that, construction of sentences and written work. It was a great deal of help.
Yeah, it's the foundation of what we're doing right now as we speak and talk and write. It's not the only influence. All of our numbers, for instance, are from the Arabic. The Romans used Roman numerals, which were characters repurposed for numbers, as we know. But they didn't have a zero, which was a real problem with arithmetic. And it took other folks to come up with characters that could represent that concept.
How would we do with ones and zeros without a zero?
I know, it kind of begs the question, doesn't it? So a couple of comments as we approach Latina. Cheryl Fair has gone a bit further than we have already and thanked everyone for their service during World War II and I suppose any time. And we join her in that. The Aviation Museum, we're all about educating kids, but we also want to preserve the stories and the experiences of people who've served the country. And aviation is our specialty, but anybody, a veteran of any branch, is welcome here, and we want to have you visit us and hear your stories. So consider that an open invitation. We're not open right now because of the coronavirus. The museum has been closed, but we're in the process of getting our act together to be able to open to the public on Saturday, July 18th. It'll be a little different experience because we've had to reconfigure our floor to meet the new guidelines from the CDC and from the state on how museums should operate. So it will be still very much worth visiting us. We have some new exhibits that we've created to make up for some of the hands-on exhibits that we've had to remove temporarily from the floor. So I encourage you to visit us. If you should know where we are online if you're watching this, but I'll say our website anyway. It's Well, the easiest way is probably aviationmuseumofnh.org. You can find everything going on there. And as a nonprofit, we are always looking for support, both volunteer support and financial support. So our sponsors have been very generous, allowing us to do this around the world flight. But all year round, we rely on contributions from people who want to support our mission to take aviation to new heights, to educate kids, to inspire the next generation of innovators. You know, someday we want to paint their pictures on our mural, people who've come through New Hampshire and have become the innovators and stars of tomorrow, so we can point to their pictures on our mural and say they started here. And to give them the start is kind of our mission. So it's still a fine day here in Italy. It's late afternoon, isn't it? It's a 6-hour time difference, so we're looking at late afternoon on the 4th of July. My name is Jeff Rapsis, and I'm on board this great old C-47, military version of the DC-3, with my friends Bob Huff from the museum's board of directors, with Chuck Guerin. Thank you for your service, sir. Retired Navy captain.
That's true, yes. Had a 28-year career flying in the Navy.
Thank you for all that, and we're proud to have you as part of our museum community. I'd like to mention that the whole idea of a round-the-world flight was Chuck's originally. When we closed for coronavirus, as the administrator, I said, anyone got any ideas? And I opened it up, and Chuck said, we have that flight simulator, and usually we use it to take off from Manchester, and if we're lucky, land in Concord, New Hampshire. And we let people try it, and, you know, it's a simulator, so people may crash, and it doesn't hurt anyone. But the world of the flight simulator is not limited to southern New Hampshire. And thanks to the expertise of Jay Carter and Aura Lassiller and Bob Huff, we've been able to put together these segments that allow us to fly all around the world. Now look at the way the water is rendered. This is all ones and zeros, but I'm fooled completely. It looks so liquid as we fly over the Italian coast.
Yeah, you can sometimes see the breakers.
Yeah, and then they render the waves as they hit the coast. It's all done by algorithms. It's all, in some cases, several different sources of information are being combined in real time to render what we're seeing as we fly over it. And Jay can even change angles and move around, and the scenery always follows us in real time. And so the kind of IT technology that's come to the fore in the last, little while in the simulator world is, I think, has a lot of potential for all of us to have experiences that, especially when we're all homebound by the coronavirus, really are a really powerful way to learn and travel and to get inspired.
And we have a partnership with the Manchester School of Technology about aviation. And before the pandemic hit, they were building an RV-12 aircraft at the school, and we were funding it. And so unfortunately that had to stop temporarily while everybody was quarantined. But we're now in the process of obtaining some flight simulators, just like you see here, for the school. So next year they will have 2 flight simulators able to fly around, learn the physics of flight and the theory of flight, and learn all about navigation. And so they'll be able to do that in the school. So it really is about education and science and technology, and giving those kids a spark on what's possible out there in the world for careers.
And we're the plane build project that Bob refers to is definitely continuing. We have had to pause it because the school was closed for the last 3 or 4 months, but this summer we've already got a plan to have some of our volunteers in there with some of the kids that'll be doing the program this coming year to continue building plane number 1. Still waiting for a name for that plane. The naming rights are still up for the highest bid, but it's still very much in progress, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that if you follow our Aviation Museum's activities online. If you'd like to learn more about us, send an email to us on the website, and we'll add you to the mailing list. We publish a frequently issued e-newsletter. We also have a printed publication called The Aeronaut, which has been on hold for a little while, but we want to restart that up, and that's a great clearinghouse for everything that we're doing here at the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire. We're heading a bit inland now, and we're heading into the what used to be in ancient times Latium, and you'll see that Italy, this part of Italy is a real mix. There's some very rough mountain terrain, but then there's some of the most beautiful farmland and agricultural land in all of Europe. And it's just almost a rural paradise for generations. The European intelligentsia of Northern Europe would look at a trip to Italy as a wonderful adventure into this sort of great wonderland of sunshine and tropical fruits that weren't common to Northern Europe. If you read the biographies of Johannes Brahms, the composers, they would look to Italy as almost like a paradise, and a trip to Italy was considered to be really a prized journey. In fact, in France, for many years, if you were an aspiring young composer, you would try to get something called the Prix de Rome, where the French government would let you go to Rome on their dime and study for a long extended period of time and drink in the Italian culture. Italy, even then, it's always been a center of culture and artistic achievement, but at that point it was looked upon as a destination for the aspiring young artist. You must go to Italy to be inspired by the landscape, the people, and the art that was made there before you.
Yeah, and I have to agree. We overnighted there in Naples last night, and not only did we drink in the culture, we ate in the culture, and the pizza is second to none anywhere. So the food is just unbelievable. It melts in your mouth. The homemade pasta is just something I've just never had before. It's just fabulous.
And there's a claim that it was invented there, right? Pizza.
The pizza in Naples, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as we
Yeah.
said in the last segment.
Right.
Yeah, there's been a debate about that, but Naples claims pizza this way. As you recall, it's always been a great center of mercantile trade. It's a seaport. And when Italy was a lot of different duchies and kingdoms before it became one nation, Naples was a great clearinghouse for all the different ships coming in and out, somewhat like Venice was, further, on the other side. And in the 1600s, sailors from trips as far away as what we now call South America were coming back with exotic fruits and vegetables, including something that we now call the tomato, which at the time people thought was poisonous, but the sailors had been eating them. They developed a taste for this tomato. Look, you can make a paste out of it. And the legend goes, they showed it to the bakers in Naples and said, if you make there's a flatbread they make there, why don't you put the tomato sauce on it and bake it with it? And these were seafaring gentlemen, and so it became their special flatbread, and it wound up being called pizza marinara, and it's because they were mariners, and you can see the language kind of influencing. Even today, we can order pizza marinara. And did you know it's because it was from sailors in Naples?
I didn't know that. Even when I was narrating yesterday and I used the term marinara, I didn't know it was from the mariners.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Pizza marinara and pizza margarita, which is named after one of the aristocrats of the era, and the colors of the toppings mirrored the flag of that family, and so it got to be called.
Well, we're forever indebted to those sailors for having brought the tomato back from South America so that we can have pizza.
So we were flying just a few moments ago. You might have seen a big green area, and that was, if you're wondering what that was, Jay and I were talking about that yesterday. It seems to be a conserved forest. Is that right, Jay?
Yeah, it's a nature preserve, and when I first saw it, I said, that looks like a problem with the scenery. Like we've got a defect, but it's because it's very sharp edges to it, all four very rectangular. But it's just a plot of land that's been preserved as a forest.
Well, and so we were talking about it. I thought it was interesting to look at it because here in the United States, it's a big country we have here. We are a large nation, and land use is always an issue. In Europe, we're looking at a landscape that has been farmed and traveled on, and wars have been fought on for thousands of years, and it's on a smaller scale to some extent than what we have here in North America. And so a tradition of land use and management is sort of more rooted in the European experience than it is here, where we kind of develop things. We invented suburbia in the United States for a reason. We have the room for it. But in Europe, you'll find that even something like a forest, it has to be accounted for and developed specifically, or otherwise it wouldn't exist, because you can see the land from one end of our windshield to another something's being done with it. It's either being farmed, or it's being lived upon, or it's being held as a forest, because forests are important to the whole ecosystem. It's been managed going way back to the Roman days, and there are even evidence of the Romans that still exist. The roads, of course, that the Romans built, many of them have survived all the way into the current day. More spectacular are the aqueducts, which the Romans got really great at building to carry fresh water from far away. I mean, Rome itself became such a huge city, they needed a lot more water than you could get from the Tiber River or other sources. So there were aqueducts built in the hills, those mountains in the background, say, that could carry fresh water just by gravity. They didn't have pumps. Literally dozens of miles from a distant source, and they would be used to create public fountains and baths all throughout Rome and other Roman cities. Interestingly, too, when I was in Italy, I learned that the Romans even mastered the technique of siphoning. So if the aqueduct had to go over a valley, right? Sometimes they'd build those enormous stone bridges to carry the water from one side of the valley to the other. But occasionally they would create a siphon. If one end of the valley was shorter or less height than the other, they created a tube that would use the principle of siphoning. So as long as it was airtight, they had lead joints they would create. It would go through a pipe down one hill, across, and then up and come out the other side, only by gravity. And they were able to get the water from one side of the valley to the other. It's remarkable that they figured that out.
It really is. The level of engineering that went on so many years ago, you wouldn't think that they would have that capability, but they really did. And they were very ingenious and able to create quite complex engineering structures.
We'll talk a lot about ancient engineering a little bit further when we get to Egypt. We're going to be flying over the pyramids, and we're going to go some other places where other remarkable engineering feats from the past have come down to us today. Right now we're flying over a city called Latina. And if you look, there's the center of Latina there, and it's very well organized, isn't it? It looks like that square, it's more of a rectangle, has boulevards coming right to it, and everything's sort of orderly. There's a reason for that. If it was a much older city, it wouldn't look like that. It would be, all the streets would be sort of ancient footpaths that gradually got, filled in. But in this case, we're looking at a city that the Romans would not have known about because it was only built in the 1930s by our friend Benito Mussolini, who was the leader of Italy at that time. And this was a planned community. It was like a rural development, as I understand it, to create jobs and to build a community to improve the standard of living in this part of the country that just happens to be also where the language of Latin first developed, in ancient times called Latium. And so the city that Mussolini got going, which is in place today, and it looks like a grand place to live, looks very well organized, is called Latina, or the city of Latium. And all around us, up to the mountains, is an area that in ancient times people would have spoke to each other in a predecessor of what we now know as Latin. It was not part of the Roman experience until the Romans started expanding out of their area from the north. And this was the language that wound up being the one that was used throughout the empire, as we said earlier, and continues to be with us today. It really looks like a nice small city, doesn't it? Like football stadium right there. When I say football, I mean what we call here soccer. But that's a really important part of European culture. Wherever you go, we're seeing the one in Barcelona was the largest one in Europe. 100,000 people could pack into there because I guess they're very serious about it. But everywhere you go in Europe, they're fanatics for football. Except in Lithuania. That was the one thing, I didn't know this, but in Lithuania, which is the homeland of my people, we did a little thing about the famous voyage from New York to Lithuania, the air voyage in 1933 that ended tragically with the pilot crashing in Germany before he reached his destination of Vilnius. But I didn't realize that the pilot, whose name escapes me right now, is Stefan. If I try to pronounce it, I would mangle it. But this was a guy who not only was an aviator, but he lived in the United States for some time, and he brought the sport of basketball to Lithuania. And Lithuania, for some reason, went crazy over basketball. And even today, it's like the major sport in Lithuania, unusually for Europe. And there's an aviator who made a big difference, but in a way that maybe he didn't expect. So we flew over Latina. The next landmark will be the port city of Anzio, which is, how many minutes away is that, Jay?
Let's take a look here.
We have all kinds of navigational assistances available to us that weren't available to a DC-3 pilot.
You can actually see it dead ahead there, that little
that
finger
yeah,
of
I see the
lancing out, so
peninsula.
it's
All
about
right,
4
yeah.
minutes away.
The harbor jetty. So Anzio, World War II, Italy. We've had Cheryl Fair encouraging us to talk a bit about World War II, and this is the one that took a long time. When we talked about Memorial Day and the invasion of Normandy, we talked about how the Allies had promised Stalin. We're talking Allies. We're talking Britain and the United States. And during World War II, Hitler invaded to the east and was heading into Russia almost from the very beginning. And the Russians, the Soviets actually, were fighting Hitler continually. And Hitler did push to the west, but he was unopposed. He took over France, took over Belgium, didn't get to England because of the English Channel. They started lobbing bombs at London, of course, and all of Britain, but Britain was not invaded. Stalin wanted to have a second front, and the Allies promised a Western front. It took years for them to get all of that stuff. Many of the stuff that they used in D-Day, many of the machines and material came through our own town of Manchester, New Hampshire, when it was Grenier Air Base. But that took longer than expected. What we could offer Stalin was this. This landscape you see here, Italy, became a constant battleground for almost the entire length of World War II. It was a very tough area that was very well defended by the Germans, who did not want the Allies to make it up the peninsula at all. It took us long enough to conquer the German presence in North Africa, and in our segment where we flew over Algeria and Tunisia, we did talk a little bit about that, and Casablanca as well. But once we got to Italy, it was no cakewalk. It wasn't for any of these battles, of course, but in Italy it was so hard fought. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the casualties are hundreds of thousands on both sides to get this island under the control of the Allies while World War II was going on. And Anzio was a major invasion point. In 1944, I believe in January, the Allies staged a major effort to land at this point to establish a presence further up the peninsula. They had already spent 2 years fighting their way up only this far, from Naples to here, and that's not that far. And their goal was, of course, to get to Rome, which is not that far away from here, and this was the place that was picked for various reasons to land huge forces at the time that were in an area that was still very well defended by the Germans and the Italians. Today it's a coastal city that you wouldn't know anything happened here, but this was a complete battle zone 75 years ago plus that was pretty much wiped off the map by all of the military activities back and forth. And what a tragedy it is when you think of how, for most of its existence, this landscape was thought of as a paradise by people here and also in Northern Europe, especially as a place to go to live the good life. And yet it became a completely hellish battle zone for years at the height of World War II. So many sacrifices were made. Long after the Founding Fathers created the nation, it was necessary to defend it. And I wonder if they ever imagined that U.S. troops would be here in Italy, storming the beaches not far from where their classical inspiration came from so many years earlier.
A good view of the breakers here at the on the seawall too. Talking about the simulation.
Mm-hmm. You can see the waves coming in, as Chuck said. So when Chuck mentioned the word virtue, that's kind of, I guess that's today's word, because what was it that prompted us to overcome? There was a great resistance to this country getting involved in another war. at the time. We had helped out in World War I, and the general consensus was never again. We fought the greatest war, right? This is the Great War, and we will never have to fight another war. And yet 20 years later, here we are again.
It
And I
might
think
be
virtue
easy.
played a role in that.
It might be easier to say what virtue was not, and that was it was not tyranny, it was not dictatorship, it was freedom, it was liberty, it was independence. And those were the things principles that we were fighting for, which were counted as part of virtue. I think intrinsically in school children's minds and in adults as they became adults. It was not just, of course, independence of thinking, but it was also patriotism and liberty that were part of virtue. Characteristics that people held.
Yeah. And when we go back to the founding of this country, the people that played major roles in that were really serious about these ideals that the Romans are among the first to articulate and to put into practice. They borrowed from the Greeks, but the Romans were sort of the high point of that in the ancient world. So you would have people like Joseph Warren, one of the names that is not well known from the American Revolution, but he was a doctor in Boston, a physician, an educated man who knew his classics, and he was a fierce proponent of independence from Great Britain. He thought it was the only way to go, and he was so strong a supporter of American independence and the inspiration of classical ideals that he would go around in a Roman toga from time to time, including making a very high-profile memorial speech about the Boston Massacre in 1775, wearing a toga right in front of the British troops. And, you know, he may as well spit right in their eye, wearing his Roman toga in 1775, making that speech that day. And he paid a price for that, because not long after that, in the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British troops singled him out to bayonet him and kill him. And there's a famous painting that we have on our website that shows the demise of Dr. Warren, who in some minds may have been the first president of the United States. He was such a strong supporter of this nation. And Roman ideals drew him on. If you look at the Continental Congress, when it was time to draft the Declaration of Independence, it was a committee that was named to do that. Jefferson did the writing, but Adams was there, and I think Franklin was on it, and the guy from Connecticut, Sherman, what was his name? Roger Sherman. I was thinking Sherman Adams, but he's the guy that did Hello Mutta, Hello Fada. Wrong guy. And
another great historical figure,
yes,
no less. But
yes, and Mr. Livingston, I forget his first name, from New York. They were all inspired by Cicero. They were all inspired by Cato. And speaking of Cato, he was the Roman statesman who, at the time the transition was happening from republic to empire, he said he felt so strongly about the ideals of the Roman Republic being preserved, and that liberty was more important than solidarity, and tyranny especially. He'd give his life for it. And in two examples of how that influenced the American Revolution was there was a play that was made, just happened to be a very popular play that was being done in colonial America, that showed that it was called The Tragedy of Cato, I think, and it showed his death because of his beliefs. And that was a huge inspiration, so much so that it was even performed for the troops in Valley Forge to help the morale at the low point of George Washington's campaign to create the new nation. It was something that influenced the writing of the Declaration of Independence as well. So these are questions that the Romans were finding their own answers to, and in many cases, as Chuck has mentioned, the virtue that they found within themselves were the ones that fueled the larger ideas of how to govern a society, how people should work together, and what your duty was to the society or the nation or the civilization that you were a part of. There's an old phrase, no man is an island. And just what kind of person you are is the ones that the Romans, I think, and we today still continue to try and find answers to that make sense.
Well, you mentioned Cato, and he actually killed himself over his principles. he died because he would not subject himself to tyranny. He would not accept any honor that would be connected with tyranny.
Yeah,
And he killed himself to avoid it.
and you can see how that would inspire John Adams. You can see how that would inspire people who were themselves
Yeah.
subject to
That's right.
losing their lives for signing that Declaration of Independence.
And it, in some people's minds, it occurred to them as a comparison between the present enemy tyranny of George III in England and Julius Caesar. And of course, Caesar was opposed to, or Cato was opposed to Caesar because of his tyranny. And that did really inspire the founders, such as John Adams, such as Ben Franklin, and Jefferson.
Another example I was hoping to mention is that Patrick Henry, who we all learned said, "Give me liberty,
Or give
or give me
you
death." I didn't realize this, but that was from that play. In Cato. And the quote is, "It is not now time to talk of aught, but chains or conquest, liberty or death." And who'd have thought? I guess it had to come from somewhere, but it's ancient Rome. George Washington took Cincinnatus as his personal role model, a citizen farmer who saw a duty to be done and a sacrifice to be made for the greater good. And then I thought it was kind of charming in a way that late in life, Adams and Jefferson, who were for a time not speaking to each other because of how presidential politics transpired, in their glory days, when they were both elderly men, they would correspond. And there are a lot of Roman references that are threaded through their correspondence. And there was one thing we found where Jefferson is complaining about how things are going in the new nation, and he writes to Adams, "I would so much prefer to read Thucydides than the newspapers." They found comfort, lifelong comfort, in the classics that they had learned as young men.
True. Very true.
So the drama of the transition from the Roman Empire from the Republic to the Empire would be played out to a large extent in the area we're going to be flying over next. We're heading inland now from the coast. Rome is on the Tiber River, and it was settled in ancient times, of course, but the first records we have are from when Rome was founded, supposedly, by Romulus and Remus. And I think historians believe this was kind of a legend created by the Romans themselves to kind of provide a great story. But there's a lot of great stories about how Rome got founded and somebody killed someone else, and it was just a way to fill in something that no one really knew. But Rome was starting to coalesce 700, 600 BC, and as I said earlier, it was a monarchy. There were kings that were ruling it. And it was about the year 500 BC when that changed to a republican model, and that formed a government that endured for centuries, for about 5 centuries, and Rome was prosperous at the time and was expanding, but it wasn't the Roman Empire just yet. It was only going to become that much later. And I think we're seeing Rome kind of coming up here. It's the big urbanized area that is
just about 5 minutes.
sprawling out in front of us. What we're going to see in Rome is it's not a museum. Rome is one of Europe's great cities in the center of Italian culture and the economy. But, in a way it is a museum, because I've never been to a place. I've been fortunate to be able to visit Rome, and I've never seen a city that is kind of more like an outdoor museum. You walk in parts of Rome, no matter what you do, walk down an alley, go into a church, and it is the most magnificently decorated church that you've ever seen in your life, until you go down to another corner and you see another one, and it's full of 2,000 years worth of art in some cases that's been accumulated, and even just a modest neighborhood church. And so what a great heritage Rome represents, going all the way back to the Romans.
And this is why this trip really makes you want to go there and be there and see it. There's such incredible sights, and the beauty and the art, the architecture. It's just fabulous.
So here's Rome, and it, like a lot of cities, the river is what really caused it to be here. It was a crossing of the Tiber River, and that developed into Rome in ancient times. The river has actually preserved part of Rome in an unexpected way. Chuck and I were talking earlier that one of the best parts of Rome that still exists from the days we're talking about, from the days of the Republic, is the Forum, which was in most Roman communities the center of like the marketplace and where you'd get all the gossip. And you see that even in like the musical comedy. A funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. The Forum is part of Roman life. And in Rome they had an enormous Forum. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Tiber River, nobody really cared about Rome that much. Ancient Rome was not what it is today in our minds. It was just another failed civilization. And I know I'm oversimplifying, but the point is that nobody was working to preserve any of these structures that the Romans had left behind. But the Tiber River would, time to time, would flood into the area where the Roman Forum was, because it's kind of a low-lying area. And over the centuries, we're talking a long time, the silt that it left behind completely covered up a lot of what the Romans left behind to a depth of 20 feet or more. And it was fortunate that happened, because nowadays archaeologists have gradually removed all this silt, and we do have a pretty good Roman Forum left to us that we can now wander amongst and look at. We'll see that a little bit from the air, but it's far more impressive if you're there in person, as we've been talking, to be there, to wander among the exact same places that a lot of these people that we can read about lived and thought and made their mark. A lot of what we'll see flying over Rome is from after the days of the Republic. When the Roman Empire was established, starting with Julius Caesar, then things really started cranking. Rome became the largest empire the world had ever seen. In a matter of just a little while, Rome expanded to as far away as Britain and Egypt, and the center of it all was right here. And so great structures were built, the Baths of Caracalla, which I don't think we'll be seeing, but which were used to model Penn Station in New York. So much great stuff got built, and we have a lot left from that today. So I think one of the most recognizable things we'll see as we get into central Rome is the Colosseum. And that is a stadium that could seat 50,000 people, all done without any computer-aided design. And it is so well built, it has endured even after being neglected for more than 1,000 years. A lot of it's just stayed there, and now it's very carefully preserved. What we have left is very well cared for, to the point where Rome has been trying to deal with automobile exhaust that corrodes the stones, something the Romans never had to worry about. But it's still there, and I'm going to take a look a little closer to see what we're going to be seeing, because we'll be able to see the site of the Circus Maximus as well, which was not far from the Colosseum. As we curve in, I think we'll see the first landmark is the Termini station of Rome, which is the main railroad station of Rome. Let me shift my view a little bit.
Over there.
So it's just under the wing on the left-hand side, and the Colosseum will be coming in on the left as we turn around. We make some turns over Rome. We have special permission to make these maneuvers. They've cleared the skies for us. There's no other aircraft to worry about. They've even somehow gotten rid of the birds. So we're right here over ancient Rome. So right near the center of the screen, you can see a building. We're going to zoom in a little bit. And that is the Roman Colosseum. It still dominates the landscape, even in our digitally rendered version of it here. And you can see part of it is not completely intact, but what's there is spectacular. We'll be seeing over it in a few minutes. The big building almost in the center of our screen as we fly over is a monument to Victor Emmanuel, one of the leaders of Italy when Italy was made into one country in the 19th century. And that's a spectacular, much later addition to the Roman landscape. But boy, does that make an impression as you're walking through the small streets of what is the center of old Rome. And that looms above you with its winged chariots and eagles and things. Mussolini, our friend Mussolini, built the road between the Colosseum and the Victor Emmanuel Monument. There's that big boulevard. That was not there. And in doing so, he bulldozed a lot of old Roman ruins, unfortunately. The Forum is right before us now and to the right. And you can see the green areas and all of the pieces of stone that are still in place from an area where you can wander. And we're flying over Palatine Hill, which is where the Roman elite, we're over what their palaces were on. And there's not much left of them, but you can wander through that and just for hours lose yourself. The Circus Maximus is just at the bottom of our screen on the right, and I think we'll see that again. There it is down there. And that would have been where you'd see those great chariot races and horse shows and other things. And this whole area was the capital of a great empire 2,000 years ago. Still a remarkable place to visit today. You can see inside the Colosseum now in the upper left-hand part of our screen. The Colosseum is, like a lot of things in Europe, so popular with visitors, it can be a real effort to actually get in. And so I think things are closed right now still because of the virus, but if you're able to visit, go early, and I get one of those time tickets to get you in. The Forum to the left is now visible, and it's this whole area that looks like a park. If we could get in closer, we're not going to be able to fly much lower than this, but you would see it slopes downward, and all that area had been covered with silt for centuries, and it's been gradually excavated. It's a low-lying area. The walls to the left are actually much higher above. You don't see the landscape, the terrain as clearly as you might if you were standing in the ground, but there's a great hill that it's called Palatine Hill that those large walls are on, and behind it you can see the Circus Maximus again, or what's left of it, that big area, that big open area, and you can still see the sort of circular end of it on the left-hand side there. The Tiber River is that sort of greenish colored thing. Been a real problem in Rome. The river is just really stressed by pollution and by all the things that happen to a river when it goes through a major city. But still it flows. On the other side of Rome, we're flying over the very central part of Rome. We'll see the Pantheon, I believe, momentarily. It's going to be a building that looks like a hole in the roof. It's funny that some of the hills have the buildings rendered on them like they're Salvador Dali designed them. Look at that. So I think we're curving back around into, this is the large park that is on the northern part of the city that, I forget the name of it, but I've walked those it's so funny to see those things rendered digitally because it's this beautiful, it's like Rome's equivalent of Central Park essentially. And we're going to be curving around and going over the northern part of Rome. Well, now we're behind, this is Vatican City actually, and there's the Vatican. We're seeing, well, that's St. Peter's, and we're seeing it from the back view of it essentially, and in front of it is the great plaza where the Pope greets the faithful whenever the Pope appears on the balcony. And the Vatican, it's an independent city-state. It's a leftover from the days when Europe was full of these small duchies and monarchies and other things. And the Vatican has endured in part because of its status as the center of the Catholic Church. I think we mentioned earlier that the Romans were a pagan society. They had their own pantheon of gods. The pantheon, I think we'll see as we fly over, will show us that. But in the late part of the Roman Empire, Constantine, one of the last emperors, made Christianity the official state-sponsored religion of what was then the remains of the Roman Empire. It was starting to get broken up. And that caused Rome to be the center of what became the Roman Catholic Church. And the original church built on the site of St. Peter's is, I think, about the year 400. Am I imagining this, or that was the site where Peter himself or Paul was entombed, and that's why that church was built there. And the Vatican has been the center of the Catholic Church and the home of the Pope ever since, except for a few times when they kidnapped the Pope and brought him to France, and the Middle Ages being what they are. We're flying over an area of Rome called Trastevere now, which is a wonderful area to explore and to find good restaurants. And the Pantheon, I guess we flew over it, but I didn't point it out. But the Pantheon is a large temple the Romans built in the early days of the empire that was supposed to be a gathering place to honor all gods. And it was built in an unusual new process using Roman concrete to create a huge ceiling with a hole in it called the oculus. And it endures today. After 2,000 years, though, so much of Rome right around it has been demolished and built up again and demolished and built up again, that the Pantheon, this grand temple, actually looks like it's sitting in a hole. You have to go down some steps to get to the front door of the Pantheon, where you go up the steps into it. And that more than anything showed me how much time has passed. You had 2,000 years. Of course, the landscape around is going to change and things get built up and get rebuilt, but the Pantheon has just been there for all those times. And that, to me, more than anything, was when we approached that. It was like you could tell you were in the presence of 2,000 years of history, just what that building looked like when you came to it, with the Latin inscriptions still there after all these years. So on this 4th of July, we just went over one of the places that gave the ideas to our founders to get the nation started in a way that they hoped would endure. And just like nothing lasts forever, the Roman Republic didn't. We're on our year 244. So we've got a great record. We are the longest running continuous form of government on the planet right now. That's something to really be proud of. I think they really chose well. And they went to Rome and others like of Greece to come up with the best ideas they felt that were timeless, that would transcend changes of style or fashion. They went for things that were universal. And it wasn't a bad idea to look to ancient Rome to allow you to sort out what is permanent and what is transitory, both about the human experience and maybe about forms of government.
And perhaps to learn about weaknesses too, or potential weaknesses, and try to avoid them.
Well, the classic phrase is that those who do not learn from history are what?
Bound to repeat it.
Condemned to make those mistakes, I guess, yes. And so Rome and so many other civilizations, I think, because the founders looked to Rome, they were showing their Western bias. And we're going to travel around the world. We're going to continue this flight, and we're going to go to places that are as far away from Manchester and Western civilization as we can. We're talking Kathmandu, Nepal. We're talking Bangkok, Thailand. And they're worth studying, too, because as you learn about them, they have stories and lessons and ups and downs that are as rich and interesting as the ones that are the direct ancestors of what led to the United States. So on this 4th of July, we all have the best hopes for the future. But I think those hopes for the future are strongest if they're rooted in the lessons of the past.
And the trip has just been awe-inspiring to me to learn about cultures, learn about history, and especially learn about the people. And I love the poem that you mentioned, Jeff, No Man is an Island. We're all part of the same world, we're all part of the same universe, and we all have a lot of the same hopes and fears, and it's been wonderful to meet people from new cultures to us, and look forward to continuing the trip to meet more people and see more history and just learn about the world in general.
Okay, and let me take a few moments to go back to our comments to catch up on some things. Our colleague Aura has made a great point. I had talked about how the Germans were fighting the Soviet Union right from the beginning. They did have a non-aggression pact that ended up not being worth the paper it was printed on. But yeah, from the very beginning, it was not the case. It was only a few years into it. So thank you, Aura. Chris Donovan has asked about the 7 Hills of Rome, and that's true. You didn't see it so well. Even today, when you go to Rome, you don't see the 7 Hills because it's such an urbanized area. But there's definitely ups and downs of Rome, and the 7 Hills are what Rome was built on. There's a lot of mythology and legends that go along with those. One of the interesting things about Rome was that just strolling around, a friend of mine and I came across a hill that was not really a natural hill. It was, we called it Pottery Hill. And what it was the place where all the shards of broken pottery were dumped for centuries, and it was enough to create a ceramic pile hundreds of feet high over the course of all this time, and then eventually trees took root and became a part. But if you dug in, you'd find broken pottery. So it was sort of a progenitor of today's, repurposed dump that we have here in New England and elsewhere, where you put a golf course on something. Well, we're coming into Leonardo da Vinci Airport, aren't we? How high are we, Jay?
Wheels down. We're on final approach.
Oh my God! I was talking. I didn't pay attention. We'll kind of lay back a bit while we make our approach. It's a big runway, and we have a lot of room to make our landing. Some of the runways have not been so, but this one's one of the big ones. So here we come in. You can hear that engine sound. It's so distinctive. Whoa!
Sorry, it don't sound like that.
Well, that was tremendous. That's a great landing. Thank you. Look at us coming down that runway.
And now we get to explore on foot.
Yes, we do. Well, we're back on the ground after taking a trip over the Italian peninsula, but also through time, going back to think about what the Romans and their inspiration, the Greeks, what role they played in the formation of our nation, which we celebrate today on the 4th of July. Today is not the day that we voted on independence. It was July 2nd. And in fact, John Adams wrote to Abigail a wonderful letter that is actually quite well known. You may have read it yourself, predicting that July 2nd would be the day that Americans from now henceforth would celebrate this date with fireworks and cannons from one end of this continent to the other. What a thing to think about in 1776, when there was no guarantee anything would work. We know now how it all worked out, but he didn't. And yet he was able to confidently say this day, which he thought would be July 2nd, would be celebrated the way we do it, by making a lot of noise. Fireworks and cannons. Maybe not so much this year officially, but it's an American tradition, isn't it? And they knew that then. July 4th, the date we are on today, was actually the day that the language of the Declaration of Independence was ratified. Jefferson's original draft was just murdered by all the other congressional, the members of the Continental Congress. Among the other issues that were debated were the presence of slavery in the nation, which continues to be an issue that we grapple with today. But in the end, they all approved the language of the Declaration on July 4th, and it was read to the public, I believe, on July 8th. It wasn't until August, some date in August, I think, that the signing took place, and that's the picture we see, in the painting. But July 4th is the day we blow off all our fireworks, so happy 4th of July, everybody.
Thank you. Another issue, just briefly, that was introduced by the Italian Enlightenment, which was not the ancient Italians, but the current Italians during the time of the founders, was part of our Bill of Rights, and that had to do with cruel and unusual punishment in the Eighth Amendment. That came out of Italy, out of Italy during the Enlightenment.
Well, I think in so many things, there's a continuity where the best things from the past are sometimes borrowed from and merged into present reality to create a better future. And so the closest I can come to making a speech today is that as someone in the museum business now, I hope that our museum is able to continue to preserve the past so that people who come after us can look at it and profit from that. If we don't take steps today to preserve some of the things that we may not understand their importance of, but they could be of great value to people in the future, then we may deprive them of something really valuable that we don't even know about. So preserving history, doing what we do here at this museum and many other museums is really an important investment in really the future of human civilization. Is that too grand to say here on this 4th of July?
Absolutely.
No, I think it fits today very well.
It fits very well, and I hope people that are listening today will come and visit the museum if you haven't already, and if you have, come again. We're always amazed at who walks through our door. The history that single person or that family brings can be incredible. Their contribution to our country, their service. Even when you're in the store, you never know who's around you, who's behind you. It's just incredible, the people that have contributed to this country and have brought us to where we are today. And it's just, we need to preserve that, recognize that.
Well, as we taxi around the airport here at Rome, it's kind of quiet, isn't it? I don't see a lot of action going on, but we're going to park, and as Bob said, get out and explore on foot. While we still have a few moments, let me thank our sponsors once again. They are the entities who've made this possible by giving us the support financially and the encouragement to take this risk. So the folks at Wirebelt, David Greer and his team up the hill here in Londonderry, New Hampshire Humanities, they've been very generous in giving us inspiration to try and pursue a project that's taken us to places we never expected it to. Our friends at the Manchester-Boston Regional Airport, the folks at Terra Fugia, we're building a new flying car. You'll see more about that soon, I hope. Signature Flight Support just down the ramp from us. Thanks, guys. The Queen City Rotary, thank you for giving us a grant to support this program. And then in-kind support from Jay Carter and his IT operation. And Aura Lassler from So Many Aircraft. Check out that website. You will see some incredible photos of our aircraft. Not specifically this one, but Aura has taken some awesome photographs of DC-3s and C-47s that you can find on his website. And thanks to everybody who's joined in with us. We've had a great attendance. I'm looking at the numbers here, and we've had some terrific comments. Folks who've been with us through to the landing have been saying thank you, and I want to thank them back. We do it because we want to give people on this Independence Day that's a little different from most others because of the coronavirus, a different way to celebrate and acknowledge this classic American holiday. The 4th of July like none other, perhaps, and we wanted to go in that direction, play off that, and give you a new way to think about the 4th of July by looking back not just to 1776, but 76 BC. I thought it was a good idea, and I think that this is the kind of programming that shows you what even a small museum can do with the kind of digital tools that are available today, and with great support from people such as Bob and Chuck here on the aircraft, and Jay, thank you. Aura and Lee and Wendell for their support. They're not here with us, but they've been really important to getting this flight off the ground. We're going to continue. Our next leg will take us eastbound. We're heading home now. We need to get back to Manchester by August 15th, which is not that far away, so we're going to be really making up some ground here. Our next segments will take us over the pyramids of Egypt, and then later we'll see the Taj Mahal. We'll see some great parts. We're going to see Mount Everest. We're going to go through the South Pacific, follow in the flight plan of Amelia Earhart. And for you conspiracy theorists, we're going to try and fly over Area 51 on our way back across North America later on in August.
Assuming we don't get captured as aliens on our way over.
That's right. Thank you. And last but not least, I want to thank all our volunteers at the Aviation Museum. We are pretty much a volunteer-driven community, and they are what makes the difference. And when we open on July 18th, the volunteers are what will make the difference when you come here to visit us. They are the museum. And our board of directors for giving us a chance to do this has been much appreciated. I'm not sure when our next live stream adventure will be, but we've shown that we can do this, and I'd love to get your ideas and your suggestions for what we can do with this sort of new model of education we've been exploring. So if you have any ideas or any suggestions, you can contact me through the website, but I'll give the email address right now. It's first letter J as in Jeffrey, then my last name Rapsis, and that's spelled R-A-P as in Peter, S as in Sam, I, S as in Sam again. So J Rapsis, 7 letters, at NH as in New Hampshire, AHS, that's A as in Apple, H as in Harry, S as in Sam, as in Aviation Historical Society. So nhahs.org, jrapsis at nhahs.org. Love to hear your comment, suggestions, or anything else you'd like to do in terms of feedback for our flight from Naples to Rome today on the 4th of July. So with that, we're going to go exploring. Have a great 4th of July, and we'll see you next time from the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire.
Happy 4th, everybody. Take care.
Good to be with you.
Bye-bye.